All right. It has been a couple of weeks since we've been together. I have missed you all. It has been too long. So praise the Lord that the weather is good now and we can join together again. This was a struggle for me to figure out what's a good place to start reviewing at so that we can have good background and pick up where we're left off. And there's just so many names and faces in this. And I know because I tested my family yesterday. I was like, do you guys remember who this person is and why he was important? No, it's not their fault. I'm in it every day. So it's very fresh to me every day. And so I'm constantly thinking about these people and what are they doing and where are they and who's doing what at this particular time. And so I've got them all in my mind fresh. And I know that for a lot of you guys, this might be the first time you're hearing about some of these people. And so it can be daunting to try to have to remember who they are and their faces. So I try to be consistent with the picture so that the pictures are always the same, somewhat label their names. This slide obviously doesn't have their names labeled, but that's because I was introducing them at the time. So we're gonna go back a little bit, just to get some refamiliarity with the names. I'm not going to cover a lot of the details. I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview because I do have a lot I want to cover today, as per usual, and we'll see how far I actually get into it. So we had talked about who was responsible for William Tyndale's death. And so in order to do that, to set the stage for that, we need to talk about some political figures that were involved. And so we talked about Henry VIII. We talked about the Queen of England, Anne Boleyn. We talked about Bishop Cutthroat Tunstall. Okay. We talked about how Tyndale's works were bought and then burned at St. Paul's Cross. And that was what Tyndale used to fund his second edition of his English New Testament. We talked about Henry, Queen Anne Boleyn, and Pope Clement's relationship with Tyndale, that Henry hated Tyndale, Pope Clement hated Tyndale, but Anne Boleyn had a soft spot for Tyndale. She had her own Tyndale Bible. She had her own works of Luther. She was favorable towards the Protestant Reformation. And so that was what this slide would have demonstrated. So, and then we also have Cromwell as the chief minister. And Cromwell is an interesting character. He is somewhat favorable to the Reformation, but he is also very favorable to power. And he sees Anne Boleyn as a potential threat for the power of Henry VIII and his own power. We see that the Holy Roman Emperor gets involved because he's the one who ultimately ends up capturing Tyndale. All right, so it's not him specifically, but his men are the ones that end up capturing Tyndale. And so then we have, let's see. Yeah, so Henry VIII wanted Tyndale back. He said, hey, give me Tyndale so I can deal with him. And Holy Roman Emperor Charles said, no, I'll do it myself. And then we have Anne Boleyn. She gets caught up in multiple issues because of her favoritism towards Protestantism, but her real crime, her real issue is the fact that she has not been able to produce a male heir. And because she can't produce a male heir, the king gets frustrated with her. They trump up a bunch of charges on her for treason. She ends up giving her only living daughter. She had several miscarriages, but she gives her only living daughter to Matthew Parker. And she is subsequently executed for treason, which was ultimately just because she just didn't give birth to a son. No fault of her own. And then Queen of England, Jane Seymour, becomes Henry VIII's new wife. Okay, we'll talk about her more later today. And let's see what else. That is pretty much it. So who's responsible for William Tyndale's death? I think all three of these guys. You've got Henry VIII, who causes Tyndale to flee to begin with because he wants him dead. You got Pope Clement, who calls him a heretic. And then you got the Holy Roman Emperor, who has to do what the Pope says to some degree. We're going to talk about that today as well. the Holy Roman Emperor ends up complying with the Pope and putting Tyndale to death. And so we have the death of William Tyndale and his and the burning of him in his last words. His last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And those would be that would happen. That would happen. And we saw that with Miles Coverdale. Miles Coverdale picks up the work. He translates the whole Bible from Old Testament to New Testament because Tyndale had only really done the New Testament and the first 5 books of the Old Testament and the book of Job, but he never completed the Old Testament. And so those works weren't published separately. They were just waiting. And we have Coverdale, who does do the whole Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, with the help of other translations, because he says right in his preface, I just don't have the same gifting that Tyndale has for languages, so I needed more help. So I used help from other translations. And we know particularly the Latin Vulgate because he was very fluent in that. And so he does the Matthew's Bible. And then, sorry, not the Matthew's Bible. The Coverdale Bible is what I wanted to cover at this point. The Coverdale Bible. The Coverdale Bible is the one he does from beginning to end. And this will become the first complete English Bible since Wycliffe. But Wycliffe translated exclusively from the Latin Vulgate. Coverdale translated from the Greek and Hebrew and used the Latin Vulgate to help him when he didn't know, particularly the Hebrews, where he was especially weak. And then we have John Rogers. John Rogers is a friend of Coverdale, and he's a friend of Tyndale. And he sees the completeness of Coverdale's work, and he sees the scholarship of Tyndale's work, and he puts those 2 works together. So you have Tyndale's Pentateuch, Job, and the New Testament with the rest of Coverdale's Old Testament, and we get the Matthew's Bible. The Matthew's Bible is super important because it gets the attention of, let's see. Yeah, this is a good place to go. So it gets the attention of Cromwell, Cranmer, and the King of England. And they seem to like his work more than they like Tyndale's. He did tone down the footnotes a little bit. Tyndale didn't have a ton of footnotes to begin with, but he had a few. And Tyndale's footnotes were not favorable towards the Roman Church, nor the King of England, or the divine right of kings and things of that nature. He also had some controversial translation choices, which we talked about last time, or a few weeks ago when we talked about Tyndale's New Testament. And some of the stuff was softened in the Thomas Matthews Bible. And so the Thomas Matthews Bible becomes the first English Bible that is given forth with the King's most gracious license, meaning this will be the first legal English Bible given license of the King. However, we did talk, I didn't bring it up, but it's going to come up again. It is going to come up again, so I'm just going to mention it now. But we did talk about the Act of Supremacy. That's what it's called, the Act of Supremacy. And the Act of Supremacy was where Henry VIII signed basically a law into place that made him head of the Church of England, severing his ties with the Roman Church. Okay, so now he's no longer attached to the Roman Church. The Pope is no longer over him. He is his own authority. There's no one above him but God. And he has in place his Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who's going to be over all of the clerics, all of the religious stuff. And then you've got your chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. He's going to be over all of the government, the people's government, things of that nature. And he's going to be over both of them. And so they say, hey, it's great. We have an English Bible. This is good for the English church. But we don't want a Bible we just licensed. We want a Bible that is ours, that we made for our church. And so they do that. They ask Coverdale. Coverdale is the one commissioned to do it. Coverdale takes, let's see, he's got the Coverdale Bible. He's got the Thomas Matthews Bible. The Thomas Matthews Bible is the one that is licensed. And all he does is a light revision of his own work, essentially his work and Tyndale's work. And it's rebranded as the Great Bible. And so we have the Great Bible, and the Great Bible becomes the first authorized Bible for the Church of England. So it's a Church of England Bible, and it's authorized, and then it's compulsory. Every church has to use it. And so what's fascinating about this whole story is still primarily Tyndale and Coverdale's work, and the New Testament is Tyndale's work. And just only a few years earlier, they were burning. And here it is now is compulsory in all the churches to be used. And so that is fascinating to me that went down that way. So that these 6 men are responsible for the first English legal Bible for us. So we get a legal Bible in English. All right, then we went through a timeline. Let's see, the chained Bible, we talked about that. So let's just go through this timeline real quick. We've got Erasmus making his Greek New Testaments, Tyndale making his English New Testament. We've got Anne Boleyn giving birth to her daughter, the Act of Supremacy, in which he separates himself from the Roman Church, 1534. Erasmus is still creating New Testaments, as is Tyndale. Miles Coverdale completes his first Bible. Anne Boleyn is executed because she is not giving birth to a son. The king has lost interest in her, and she's favorable to the Protestant Reformation. 3 strikes, she's out. And Erasmus dies, natural causes. Tyndale completes his last edition of the New Testament, and then he's martyred. Then we get the Matthew's Bible. Then we get the Great Bible, and we talked about the Taverner's Bible last time we met. I'm not going to recover that. We will. You can just go back and listen to the videos last time. And then now we're going to try to pick up with somewhat new material. All right, but we have to. I was trying to march through the Reformation, and I realized we're going to introduce characters. We're going to introduce people that I've only glossed over, and I want to spend a little bit more time developing their story so you know who they are. But in order to do that, we have to go back. So 1516 is where my earliest point is on the timeline. We got to go back to 1509. So it's not on the timeline. We're going to go back to the beginning of King Henry's reign, when Henry takes the throne. When Henry takes the throne, he's 19 years old. Okay, so he's 19 years old, and he has an older brother who would have been in line to be the king of England after his father. So Henry VII is his father, and his older brother would have taken the throne, Arthur, but Arthur died in 1502 from an illness, making Henry next in line for the throne. So in 1509, when Henry is appointed to the throne, we've got Queen of England, Catherine of Aragon. She would have been the queen because she was married to his older brother. They had been married for about 5 months, but he was deathly ill for all of those 5 months. And she comes from a very powerful family. She comes from a line of royalty. And so they see her as perfect to be Queen of England. She's the perfect candidate. So they tell Henry he needs to marry her. Okay. But in order for Henry to marry her, it was actually against the law for him to marry her because she was married to his brother, and he couldn't marry his brother's wife. So they went for the Pope to ask for a dispensation. Can I marry her? Can you give us a special exemption? And the Pope said he would, under one condition. The condition would be, did Catherine and Arthur ever consummate the marriage? Catherine declared that she did not, that the fact that Arthur had been sick for the past 5 months prevented any of such activities, and therefore that never occurred. The Pope said, that's good enough for me. You guys can get married. So the Pope gave special dispensation for Henry and Catherine of Aragon to get married. Catherine, like we talked about with Anne Boleyn, remembers his second wife. This is his first. All right. Had several miscarriages. She had, I believe, let's see if I put it in my notes. I don't know if I listed it out. I don't think I did. But I think she had roughly 4 or 5 stillborn children, 2 of them male. And so she was not able to produce a live male heir for King Henry. Remember, this is really important for King Henry. And to understand the importance of a male heir for King Henry, you kind of have to just go back through English history and what happens every time you don't have a male heir and you die. And you end up with civil wars, you end up with all sorts of stuff. Well, the Tudor, Henry Tudor, that's his name. That's the dynasty that they're in. His father started this dynasty. He wants this dynasty to continue. He doesn't want to die without a male heir. He wants this to be the family legacy. So this is really important for him. And Catherine is able to eventually give birth to a male son who is not stillborn. He's born in January of 1511. They had a huge celebration in England, fireworks, cannons. It was a huge deal. Unfortunately, in February, late February, the following month, the child dies. And so he loses that male heir. He's frustrated with Catherine, as if she has any control over any of this. But he's frustrated with the whole situation, and he begins to question his marriage with her. Now, he was known for having many mistresses. Okay, so he was not a faithful husband. And one of his mistresses was Lady Blount, Lady Elizabeth Blount. She was also called Bessie by her friends. Okay, so Lady Elizabeth Blount is one of the mistresses he had. The affair started sometime, it's rough, sometime around 1514, 1515, and she inevitably gets pregnant. And she gets pregnant and she has a son, and his name is Henry Fitzroy. The problem is he's illegitimate because she's not his wife. This is the first male son that survived past infancy. And this is also the only illegitimate son that Henry recognizes. Okay, so there are potentially other children that he had, but he did not recognize them. And if the king said, that's not my son, then that's not his son, regardless of what the mother said. So this one he recognized. He said, this one is my son, but he's illegitimate. And as you can imagine, his relationship with Elizabeth Blount and Henry Fitzroy is going to cause a huge divide between him and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, as one would expect. But here's the problem for Henry. Henry has a male son with Elizabeth, with Blount, and he has none with Catherine. And so in his mind, I'm not the problem. She's the problem. I'm able to produce a male son. She's not. And so he begins to decide that he wants to file for an annulment. And his reasoning for an annulment, and he needs to get so he asked Cardinal Wolsey. Cardinal Wolsey is like the most powerful man in England next to the king himself. Okay, he is super powerful. And he was being considered to be a pope himself. And he says to Wolsey, hey, give us an annulment. And Wolsey says, I can't give you the annulment. I don't have the power to give you an annulment because your marriage was a special dispensation by the Pope. Only the Pope can undo that. And so he says, go to Rome, go to the Pope and get an annulment. And his evidence that he was worthy of an annulment and not a divorce, because there's a difference. The annulment is saying that the marriage was never legitimate to begin with. That's what he wants. He wants a recognition that the marriage was never legitimate to begin with. And what's his evidence that it's never legitimate? He says, he quotes Leviticus 20:21, if a man marries his brother's wife, it is impurity. He has violated the intimacy that belongs to his brother. They will be childless. And so he says, look, I'm childless. Clearly, she consummated the marriage. This is evidence because we don't have children. And the pushback was, yes, you do. You have a daughter. He had a daughter with Catherine. He said, I don't have a son, though. And if I don't have a son, I might as well be childless. So that's his reasoning. What's also interesting, I don't remember if I put this in my notes later or now, but he seems to ignore the Levirate marriage, which is the exception to this rule. If your brother dies without children, you were compelled to marry your brother's wife and raise children in his name. I was looking to see if that ever came up in conversation. If you're going to apply Leviticus 20:21, you got to apply Deuteronomy, and it doesn't come up. It's like no one wants to touch that issue. But I was like, this is a totally legitimate marriage, regardless of whether or not she consummated the marriage with Arthur. He died without children, and so the Levirate marriage would kick in. And anyway, I was looking for that argument against Arthur. No one seems to make it. That what's being made, what keeps being brought up is you do have a child. You have a child with her. It just happens to be a daughter. So anyway, Wolsey, this becomes called the great matter in history. Wolsey goes to Pope Clement to get this, to basically say to Pope Clement, hey, you are under false pretenses when you made your special dispensation. So you can undo it without any harm to your reputation or anything of that nature. You were lied to. And so since you were lied to, just reverse the special dispensation, give us an annulment. But there's a major problem. What's also happening, if you remember, we talked about Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He gets involved. Charles V sacks Rome. Charles V, as Holy Roman Emperor, he sees the Roman Church as not aligning their interests with his interests. And so he's got some military power, so he goes to Rome in order to convince the Pope to realign his interests by force. And this is important. Why is Charles V important here? Well, because Charles V is the nephew of Catherine Aragon. And Catherine does not want a divorce. She comes from royalty. She's in a high, powerful position. She does not want to lose her position. And this is not a bad position, not a bad ally for the Holy Roman Emperor to have in the throne should something happen to Henry. Henry and Charles's relationships have been in an ebb and flow. Sometimes they're allies, sometimes they're enemies. And so the Holy Roman Emperor has the Pope under his thumb at this point in time. And so when Wolsey shows up to ask for an annulment, you've got Charles V influencing the Pope's decision. And so the Pope says, no annulment, no divorce. And so Wolsey goes back to the king to let him know that he was not granted the annulment. And the king then strips Wolsey of all of his power, all of his wealth, and pretty much everything that made him important. And Wolsey ends up dying just about a month or two later. And some suggest that it was natural causes through sickness. Others suggest that he might have ended his own life due to the shame. It's a little bit unsure as to exactly what happened, but he ends up dying shortly thereafter. This is where Queen Anne Boleyn is introduced. Anne Boleyn had been seducing the king. She wants the throne as well, and they had a secret relationship, just like he did with Blount, and he ends up marrying Anne Boleyn in 1533 in secret. Not sure what good that does for him, but he's married to her in secret. So now he has two wives, which, by the way, he was going to ask the Pope to give him an exception. If you can't divorce us, let me have two wives. And this was totally unheard of in this day and also illegal. And so that was not granted either. So he marries Anne Boleyn in 1533, inadvertently, not inadvertently, but essentially giving himself two wives now. So now he has two wives, and then he signs the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy, I don't need the Pope. I am the head of the Church of England. I annul this marriage. And so he annuls the marriage, severs his ties with the Pope, and he annuls the marriage with Catherine, making his marriage with Anne Boleyn official. That's important. All right. Then we talked about Anne Boleyn being favorable to the Protestant Reformation. She has her own works of Luther, and she has her own personal copy of the Tyndale Bible. Like Catherine, she's unable to produce a male heir. So we're just rehashing real quick what happened to Catherine. Also, a point that happened to Henry that I didn't mention last time, but this is also because I had it in my head too. I'm like, why does he annul the marriage with Catherine, but he has to kill Anne Boleyn? Like, what's the rush? Why does he have to rush this? Why can't he just build a case against her and so on and so forth, make up lies? This is not unheard of, Henry VIII. But what happened was, I think this becomes the catalyst for Henry. Henry was athletic. Henry loved games, outdoor games, physical games, sporting, wrestling, jousting, hunting, uh, uh, shooting, archery. If it was physical, he was doing it. He loved it. And jousting was one of his favorites. He liked jousting. However, in one of these times where he was jousting, he had an accident in which he fell off his horse and his horse fell on him. And that accident caused him to be unconscious and knocked him out for a few hours, to the degree that the doctors didn't think he was going to make it. They thought he was going to die. He does make it. He comes out of that. But at that point, he's faced with his severe mortality here, his imminent mortality. And he realizes, I have no son. If I died right now, I'm in trouble. And so he sets his eyes on another woman, and he sets his eyes to get rid of Anne Boleyn as quickly as possible. And so Anne Boleyn ends up getting executed. Also, remember his illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy. He's setting Henry Fitzroy up to be that male heir should something happen to him, because it's the closest thing to a male heir he's got, even though he's illegitimate. I believe it's about a month or two after he executes Anne Boleyn, Henry Fitzroy dies at the age of 16 from a sickness. So now he's back to square one. He has no male heir, legitimate or otherwise. And so he ends up with Jane Seymour. Now, we'll pick up with Jane Seymour in a minute, but we have to deal with some other characters before we get there. Anne Boleyn's not the only one being influenced by the Protestant Reformation. He's got his Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer, who is also being heavily influenced by the Protestant Reformation. And Cranmer, we talked about him. He was one who was influential in getting the Matthew's Bible licensed and influential in getting the Great Bible created and authorized. So Cranmer, they have an English Bible in their churches, so they can read scripture in English, but all of their liturgy is still in Latin. And so they have mixed language services, and this is the norm for quite some time. So you have the preaching and teaching, the sermon itself in English, but the liturgy, the repetition, the recitation, and things of that nature, the structure is still in Latin. And so Cranmer begins to write. He wants to see that change. He wants a full English service. He wants Latin to be set aside. He wants the people to understand what it is that they're saying and have an English service. So he starts writing what is called the litany. The litany is basically a set of structured prayers. And along with the litanies, he's producing other types of confessions and liturgy and things of that nature. He's borrowing from the Eastern Orthodox Church. He's borrowing from Martin Luther, and he's borrowing from some other sources as well. And as he's doing this, he's producing works, but Henry's reading them and he's rejecting some of them. He's saying, no, that doesn't align with the theology that I have. That doesn't align with the theology I have. That doesn't align. So he strips that stuff out. However, Cranmer's putting it in because he believes this stuff. And when Henry pushes back, Cranmer does not. Cranmer just does what the king asks without question. And so there are many historians who are like, this must have been wrenching at him because he's writing stuff early on, or he's allowing stuff early on as the head bishop in all the churches. He's allowing stuff to be said, to be taught that he just doesn't believe. And so that must have been tearing at him. Now, in his early works, where he starts with the litany and things of that nature, he's making quotes. He's quoting scripture from the Matthew's Bible. Okay? But then we get the Great Bible, and he starts to do, he's continuing his work. And now he switches in his works that he's putting together, his litanies. Now he's switching to the Great Bible for his for his works. So we have Matthew's Bible quotes in his works, and then we have great Bible quotes for this works. It's important. It's going to come up later. Okay. And then we have Cranmer, who's highly influential, and we have Jane Seymour. Okay, we talked about Jane Seymour. That's his third wife. Okay, his third wife. Jane Seymour is her family. Her family is very favorable to the Protestant Reformation. They're supporting it. They're financing it. They're doing whatever they can to help it. Jane Seymour is the wife of this king who, while he agrees with some of the Protestant Reformation, especially undermining the authority of the Pope and things of that nature, he's not in the same camp. And so Jane comes off very moderate in what we know about her and her religious beliefs. She's very moderate, favorable towards the Reformation, but not as favorable as her family, who's financing it and doing things of that nature. However, Jane Seymour is able to do what none of his previous wives were able to do. Jane Seymour has a son, and her son becomes Prince Edward VI. Now, that comes at a heavy cost. Jane Seymour gives birth, and then 12 days later, she dies from complications from the birth. And so she does not live much longer. This becomes an important point for Prince Edward VI. So here we have the Church of England's English Bible. We have the Great Bible. The English Bible has some relative peace. No one's trying to ban it. No one's trying to take it away. It's being forced on churches. Protestants are not in relative peace, but the English Bible is. Protestants are still struggling with being killed. The church has slowly incorporated minimal amounts of English liturgy, thanks to Cranmer, and Seymour gives birth to Edward and passes away right after. Henry is now without a queen. And in 1547, Henry VIII dies. Sorry, we're not ready to talk about that yet. I got ahead of myself in my notes. Forget that part. We'll get there. All right. Henry right now is without a queen, okay? Because he's not without a queen when he dies. So that's why I got ahead of myself in my notes. Those should have been deleted. And he's without a queen. And Henry asks Cromwell to find him a new wife. Cromwell knows of a potential candidate, but Henry has never met her, and he isn't sure if he wants to agree to marry someone sight unseen. So Cromwell has a painter come in and paint a picture of Anne of Cleves. And the painter paints a very flattering picture of her, and Henry is impressed. And he agrees to marry her. He's like, if that's what she looks like, I want her. And unfortunately, she does not look like her profile pic. So when he meets her, he's very displeased with how she looks. He does marry her, and he annuls the marriage immediately after. She's treated with respect, but she's put away, and then he has Cromwell killed for treason. I'm not making this stuff up. Henry is pretty crazy. So Henry marries his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine Parr is a very intelligent woman. She's strongly favored, and she is very, very heavy in favor of the Protestant Reformation. Her and Cranmer start moving Henry and the Church of England in a more Protestant direction, away from the Roman Church. However, there are doctrines that Henry will not give up. There are doctrines that Henry is just firm on, that he believes is to be true. One of them, just as an example, is transubstantiation. The Catholic Church, the Roman Church, is affirming transubstantiation. The Protestant Reformation is rejecting it, and Henry VIII is affirming it. So he's not willing to give up certain doctrines, that being one of them. So he wouldn't budge, and so Catherine and Cranmer, again, they're doing this gently with Henry. They don't want their heads on a stick. So when Henry pushes back, it's like, oh, you're right. I didn't realize. Okay. And so they move him gently. So now, 1547, Henry dies, not without a queen. Catherine is still queen. And Catherine, very favorable to the Reformation. But Edward VI, he takes the throne at the age of 9 years old. 9 years old. And the people who are raising him, guiding him, forming his theology are his stepmother, Catherine Parr, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. So Edward VI was the first king to be raised exclusively Protestant. He was a Protestant king through and through. And so he's easy to move in that Protestant Reformation direction because he's in favor of it. This is what he believes. And so he also moves the Church of England, to more Protestant beliefs and doctrines. And Cranmer now has the chance to finally make the changes in liturgy that he couldn't make under Henry VIII. And so he produces the Book of Common Prayer. And so he has the Book of Common Prayer in 1549. Cranmer releases this, essentially outlining all the liturgy and the special services that would be conducted in the Church of England. This is the Book of Common Prayer in my hand here. This is the 2019 version, so it's in modern English. I've been going through this. It's very interesting. We should talk more about it at some time. But essentially overnight, all of the Latin in the church, gone. Church services from that point forward are entirely in English. There's no more Latin. Any Latin that was left is absolutely gone. And you may not realize it, but we are still following Book of Common Prayer traditions, even here. For example, maybe you'll recognize this line: "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together in the presence of God to witness and bless the joining of this man and this woman in holy matrimony." That's straight out of the Book of Common Prayer. Our wedding services are almost entirely identical. Our traditional wedding services are almost identical with what is going on in the Book of Common Prayer. Let's see, I gave the list of things. Exchanging of vows, the introduction, the declaration of intent, the giving away of the bride, the exchanging of rings, being in the presence of witnesses, and the benediction by the minister is all laid out in the Book of Common Prayer. And it's laid out essentially the way we do it when you go to a traditional wedding. Funeral services, maybe you'll recognize this line: ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Okay, that's from the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer, it structures all sorts of stuff. It has structures for morning prayers, midday prayers, and evening prayers. Family prayers, family songs. It has a structure for the Eucharist service, the Lord's Supper, as we call it. Services for ordaining bishops and deacons and priests. Dedicatory service for a place of worship. So when you're like, hey, this is where we're going to have a church, and they dedicate that place as a sanctuary, there's a dedicatory service that's laid out. Special liturgy for things like Good Friday and Easter. And of course, it has early creeds and confessions in it as well. I wrote more in this. It's not more, it's Cranmer. The project Cranmer started in 1537 is now complete in 1549. This is 12 years worth of work in Cranmer's life. And so this becomes a major turning point for the Church of England. England is now a safe haven for Protestants. And so in the 1540s, if you were Protestant, there were a few places you could go and be safe. One was England. You could go to England and you could be safe. Second, you could go to Saxony and join with Luther and Philip Melanchthon. Third, you could go to Switzerland and you could join either John Calvin or Henry Bullinger. Okay, the two that I put like overlapping each other, they're in agreement. They are, one is a disciple or discipling the other. And with the case of Calvin and Bullinger, they are not in agreement. They have stark differences between them, but they are all unified by the Protestant Reformation and the core tenets of the Protestant Reformation. But they're not so unified that they can worship and serve together either. And so what you see are early denominational distinctives forming. Okay, that's what's occurring. But they are unified by their core tenets of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is gaining massive momentum. There's a lot of places where Protestants can go. The Roman Church is bleeding members left and right, and this is a problem. And so they have to respond. And how they respond is with the Council of Trent in 1545 to 1563. It starts in 1545, but they meet regularly for the next 18 years to discuss issues occurring in the Protestant Reformation. And so they have to deal with things. We talked about the Council of Trent earlier when we talked about the canon. We talked about how the Council of Trent handled the canon. But that's not the only thing they dealt with. They dealt with the authority of Scripture and tradition, the justification by faith alone, whether or not that's something they affirm, the sacraments, the Eucharist, whether or not it's transubstantiation or not. And what they were doing is they were clarifying, defining, and solidifying the doctrines that they had. And there were some changes that they actually made, things that the Reformation said, hey, you have to do this. The abuse of simony, which is the practice of priests being able to buy and sell church offices. So I want to be a pastor now. Okay, well, do you have the money for it? Yep, here you go. So it's not qualifications, it's financial backing. And the other thing was indulgences. The Catholic Church started putting heavy restrictions on the use of indulgences. They didn't get rid of them. They just put heavy restrictions on them. And they ended the abuse of simony at that time. But ultimately, what they were dealing with at the Council of Trent was being able to condemn the entire Reformation as a whole as heretical. Okay, which would include the Church in England. It would include what's going on in Saxony, and it would include what's going on in Switzerland. And so we'll pick up next week with Edward and some other major impacts that he has, and some of the reasons why I introduced some of these characters early on. They're going to be brought back up, and we'll pick this up next week. You all are dismissed.